Hi, y'all. Welcome to another episode of Married to a Shrink. I'm Allie, the shrink, licensed couples therapist and sex therapist. And today we are going to talk about boundaries within a relationship, surrounding the context of relational dynamics. And I have my handsome husband and partner, Michael, with me. I'm going to let him introduce himself.
Howdy, y'all. Glad I get to have this conversation with my beautiful wife and partner, Allie. I am not a therapist, by the way. I'm just a regular average Joe.
Yeah. Learning the skills along the way.
That's right.
So my first question to you is, how would you define boundaries in the context of our relationship?
I think boundaries in regards to our relationship is kind of that imaginary line that separates where my space is and my emotional space and physical spaces, and where it butts up to you or others.
Okay. Do you feel like you have historically struggled with boundaries?
I have absolutely struggled with boundaries historically.
I like how you admit it on here. Like, you have a hard time admitting these things at home, but here on a public forum where we're very vulnerable, you just go straight to it. I love it, babe. That's great. So what were your initial thoughts and feelings? Let's go back to the beginning. What were your initial thoughts and feelings surrounding boundaries when we first started dating?
Well, talking specifically with regards to our relationship, or just boundaries in general?
Let's start with boundaries in general, and then we can move it towards our relationship.
Sure. So boundaries in general isn't something I had a whole lot of experience with. Prior relationship, there were no boundaries, and it was not a safe space. And the fact that there were no boundaries caused trauma, caused issues in our relationships and my own mental health. It made a big impact. With regards to our relationship and kind of how boundaries work, you really kind of introduced me to it on how a healthy relationship has boundaries. I think coming into it, I think I was fearful of boundaries. I think my parents, we've talked about my parents' relationship, and, they've been married since 1972. So they've got a long relationship. So they were what was modeled to me, and certainly would love to be married to you for as long as they've been married and then some. But they're very enmeshed in their relationship.
They're very enmeshed.
And they do everything together, and I can't imagine them doing something on their own without the other. So with that in mind, that's what I somewhat anticipated with my own relationship, was that my partner wants to be with me, and I want to be with my partner because I care about them and I enjoy their company. So I think with that in mind, I wouldn't have boundaries. I was afraid of that. And I think some of that probably stems from abandonment issues or fears.
And to your point, I think it's interesting, and I think it's valid that you associate connectivity and wanting to spend all your time with someone as making, therefore, boundaries like inappropriate or harmful to the relationship. Or if you're not spending all your time together and you have boundaries in place, then therefore you're not as in love, or you're not as connected. Is that kind of your narrative?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so, because I will bring up, so when we first started dating and I would elicit boundaries, you found it threatening to the relationship. Would you agree with that?
I think looking back, I probably did. I felt on less sure of footing. I didn't know what to think.
Yeah.
It's like, I enjoy my time with this person. I want to be with them,
Yeah. Well, and I think, because that's where I started with boundaries with you, was boundaries around time, right? And because those are not as complicated around, as opposed to boundaries around emotions and and physical safety, and like not safety, but just the physical boundaries, those can become more triggering for folks. And so when we did partner and we were in that honeymoon phase where we just couldn't get enough of each other, and you had a hard time with the fact that I had already started to elicit boundaries surrounding personal time, right? Because I was a single woman with my two dogs, Rome and Austin, and I would be like, no, I'm not going to see you tonight. And that was challenging for you, right? And then we moved on to kind of having to elicit other boundaries. And so talk to me a little bit about what comes up for you or the discomfort that you experience when I started to elicit boundaries around like an emotional response, or you would say something and I would say, hey, that's a boundary cross for me because that makes me feel, powerless, or that makes me feel uncomfortable, and I am not okay with those words or that action. How did that kind of start to affect your psyche and your narrative?
Well, I think, again, in the early stages of our relationship, boundaries were new to me in just in relationships in general. So, I felt things were going great with our relationship. We were growing closer. And I think that when you first started setting boundaries, like I said, it put a little bit of fear in me. Like, I didn't necessarily see things from the bigger picture. Like, I think now I recognize that boundaries are a good thing. Yeah. And it's a safe thing, and it's something that relationships should have. But in those early stages, when you were first kind of introducing me to boundaries and setting these, I don't want to say rules, but, parameters that you've got your time, I've got my time, and we've got our time together, I think I was a little threatened in the moment. Mm-hmm. Fear, abandonment, past things just kind of, I think, leading to those feelings.
I think you struggled less with the physical boundaries as you did when I started setting emotional boundaries, right? When I started to say things like, hey, that's a boundary cross for me. And so I'd be curious to hear from you on how you feel about the way I communicate boundaries, because from a therapeutic perspective, the setting of boundaries preserve the sense of self, which allows for the opportunity for resentment to become less opportunistic, right? And so, not to double the words up there, but the whole idea being if your boundaries are constantly being crossed, you become agitated, you become less aware of kind of what you are needing and if your needs aren't being met, because a boundary is saying, hey, this is what I'm okay with. This is what I'm not okay with. And when people continuously cross that, you start to feel agitation, you start to feel maybe unsafe, and you start to get resentful, especially if it's with a spouse or a long-term partner of which you have worked really hard to create all this trust. And every time a boundary is breached, that trust starts to erode, right? Especially if you're communicating, hey, I thought we talked about this. Like, during these hours, this is my solo time, and I'm not going to be texting, or I'm not going to be calling, or, I didn't like how you said that. That was uncomfortable for me. That's a boundary for me. I don't want us to use those words, right? And so whenever those boundaries are set, and then they are not respected by the other person, that creates resentment, agitation, loss of safety, and with an emotional environment. And so I've seen a lot of my couples experience that, especially when there's a mismatch in experience with setting boundaries, and also association with when there are no boundaries, right? If boundaries aren't being set, then you're constantly breaking trust through boundary breaches. And so I know that I'm very, like we've talked about, probably overly so direct in my communication, especially around my boundaries. And so how do you feel about how I speak about my boundaries and how I set boundaries with you? Is there diction that you like or don't like in the way I express my boundaries?
I think initially with your directness, it was a little unsettling, but it comes from a place of comfort now. I like that you are direct and that you say, hey, this is what you did. This is how I feel. You crossed a boundary. Let's not do this again or do this differently next time. Initially I was a little uncomfortable with it just because it was so out of the norm. But I'm definitely to the point where it's appreciated and in how you communicate your boundaries. And I think it's important to, for people in partnership when they are setting and expressing those boundaries, I think it's just setting them and communicating them in just a kind manner. And I mean, this I think kind of flows through previous conversations we've had, during our podcast. The tone in which you express them means so much, and it's how that tone comes across. It's not just the words, but and you do a good job of saying so in a loving tone, expressing those boundaries.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I would also have accepted constructive feedback if you had it. But I know that, again, because of my therapeutic background, I don't have the struggle of setting boundaries for myself. But I know that you do for yourself. So can you talk a little bit about what skills you have learned so that you can start to set boundaries, or if you feel like you do set them, and if you don't, kind of what you feel like you should be applying so that you cannot be resentful towards me? Because I'm going to inadvertently cross a boundary, especially if I don't know it exists.
Sure. I think I need to get better about expressing boundaries. From time to time, I think I sometimes don't. And to your point, I don't say resentment builds, but it the hurts.
Your feelings get hurt.
Your feelings get hurt, and it starts to build, and you start to your point, it hurts the trust a little bit. I think historically, again, I didn't set boundaries in my world. I didn't set boundaries well with regards to prior relationships, with work. I oftentimes would be bringing work into my home, into my family time. So it's not just with relationship dynamics. It's also with, I think with your career and your profession. I struggled with it. I really struggled with learning how to set boundaries. And I was someone that I like to please people. And I think, saying no can be hard. And sometimes I think to avoid conflict, I wouldn't set the boundary and just kind of go along with it and kind of feel like I was biting my lip and just kind of going through with it just to avoid that conflict or avoid the uncomfortability of saying no or expressing a boundary.
Well, and what I struggle with in that narrative is if it's a boundary for you, then that's the preservation of yourself. And so the fact that you are coming from the narrative that is to set a boundary for yourself is a negative thing within a relationship is sad for me. I don't know how else to explain that. You know what I mean? And I know you don't operate like that anymore, but it's challenging for me to just kind of hear that and knowing that like it's taken you a while to kind of recognize that boundaries are really valued in a really loving partnership. Does that make sense?
No, it makes absolute sense.
Well, and I mean, to further to further elaborate on kind of your lack of boundaries in relationships, do I have your permission to kind of high level outline kind of your first serious relationship? Do I have permission for that?
Please, sure,
So
absolutely.
to kind of illustrate Michael's lack of boundaries and his lack of understanding for boundaries was his first serious relationship, first 4-year relationship was with his college roommate. So he literally never dated. They were literally they were living together when they were dating.
Paired with a roommate matching service.
Paired with a roommate matching service. And so he walked in to his apartment, was very attracted to his roommate. They started dating, had a 4-year relationship. Does that sound right?
4 years, yeah.
And so he cohabitated with the first person he ever seriously dated. So I feel like that is an example. When we say lack of boundaries and that you didn't understand boundaries, I feel like that really kind of illustrates what your base comes from.
Came from a place of experience.
Came from a place of experience. And we have talked about how, if our children were ever in that situation, we would be like, fantastic that you want to date them. When are you moving out? Because you are not going to cohabitate with someone while you're starting to get to know them. You can't set any boundaries. If you're starting to date someone and be sexually active with someone and y'all are cooking all your meals together or you're crossing paths to go to the bathroom, like it's just that kind of enmeshment at that stage is just wild.
Yeah, well, we've talked about this extensively.
And so I feel like I was just giving our listeners just kind of an example of where you're coming from when we say that you didn't have boundaries in relationships. That's, again, to your point, your parents' example of what was modeled for you. And then your first serious relationship, first person you ever truly dated was your roommate who you automatically started living with the moment y'all started dating, and then moving into other relationships that lacked boundaries because you didn't pick up any skills under that dynamic, right? And so then you move into our relationship, of which I'm very boundaried because I recognize from a therapeutic lens the importance of those boundaries so that there isn't resentment and that there is ability to kind of nurture aspects of intimacy and other things that are really important to kind of keep romance and sexual attraction and things like that alive, right? That you have to kind of maintain through what I would call is like intimate separateness, right? Is making sure that you have your time, which is one part of a boundary, is the respect around time spent, but also respect around actions relayed to the partner or emotions displayed to the partner, right? Like that's a boundary cross when you say that to me or how you handled that crossed my feeling of emotional safety, right? Like, an example would be, if voices are raised or like, there's a sense of shouting, that's a boundary cross for me. That makes me feel unsafe to engage. And so that's where you have to like lay down that boundary and say, we can't raise voices. That's a boundary cross for me, right? But again, those are all skills that you started learning in your late 30s after, 20 years of dating. And so with all of that, elaborate a little bit more on where boundaries have felt uncomfortable, what boundaries I have set that have felt uncomfortable now, and where you feel like the struggles are in relation to.
This is an easy one. I would say the time that boundaries becomes still somewhat uncomfortable is in the bedroom with regards to intimacy. We've talked about, for me, intimacy is not an easy topic to talk about So in
Are
the
you
moment,
talking about sex? Is that what
I'm,
we're
ta-
talking
I'm
about
talking
with
about sex.
intimacy?
Yes, talking
Again,
about
you can't
sex.
even say it.
That's I think where boundaries still can be a little uncomfortable for me at times.
Yeah, and we'll talk about this in greater detail during our sex episode that's coming up in a couple weeks. I'm gonna definitely have to prep you for that. Really give you the date on that.
I may
But
need to take a shot before that one.
I know, right? especially for you. But yeah, because there are, as a trained sex therapist, consent is a big part of that dynamic. And I think in our culture and in, being the cisgender male that you are and kind of those cultural norms that have come your way and the media expectations and all of that, there has always been, I feel like, a narrative that originally came into our sex life that there wasn't a true grasp of consent. There wasn't a true grasp of approaching boundaries within that intimacy setting in a way that could still be fun and sexy.
Mm-hmm.
Is that?
No, that's totally fair. I think for our listeners, there's also the dynamic with regards to that. Consent is important, but there's trauma that you have.
I have sexual trauma. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's true. Yeah.
So I think that absolutely plays a role in it, and that's something I have to respect and understand as your partner.
Because that's a dynamic that we have to navigate. And, 1 of 3 women experience sexual trauma. So
that's a scary statistic with 2 daughters.
Right.
It's a really scary statistic.
Right. Which is why we have so many conversations about it, probably at nauseum. Mm-hmm. And we work not to have those conversations during our intimate time. But to your point, there are times when a boundary is crossed for me during our intimacy. And because of my sexual trauma,
You shut down.
I shut down.
Mm-hmm.
And
takes the wind right out of the sails.
Takes the wind right out of the sails. And then you have, since you have learned more about the trauma related to women in general in our society and my personal story, you have gotten more empathetic and less reactive to that. But I know that whenever I would set a boundary, historically, kind of, I would say after our honeymoon phase, where I would set a boundary in that moment, and it would be not only deflating, but you would get angry or agitated by it. Like, I'd say it'd be more than like, it would take the wind out of your sails, and that wind out of your sails, to use your phrase, would lead to this irritability.
No, I definitely can acknowledge that was probably the exact feelings in those moments, in those early phases when it would come up. And again, I was learning at that time.
100%. But and then that irritability would make me feel even further triggered, because with all sexual trauma is the association of aggression. It's hard to have sexual trauma without part of that being aggressive or violent in some capacity, mm-hmm. right? And so that would even further my feelings of
lack of vulnerability.
Lack of vulnerability, for sure.
A lack of vulnerability, a lack of trust.
A lack of safety.
Mm-hmm.
I would feel unsafe. Mm-hmm. And when you feel unsafe, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's that little triangle. People can look it up if they want. But what it is that you have to have certain things met before you can move on to the next thought process or life change or ideology. And so when you're feeling unsafe, well, no, I can't be vulnerable, especially when it would come to my body. Mm-hmm. And that kind of lack of vulnerability would lead towards frustration towards you, which would lead to a sense of feeling like there was an ownership over my body, and that was such a boundary for me. Would you agree with
No,
this?
that's what you had expressed, and I think for me in those moments, it's hard when, again, this is looking at a rear view
100%.
lens.
Yeah.
When things are moving along from an intimacy standpoint in the bedroom between the sheets, and
I like how you kept going with that. I think you'll know at this point what you're meaning by intimacy because you've talked about it like that. But it's funny that you were like, just so y'all know, I'm still not going to say the word, but I'm going to do more innuendos towards it. That's funny, babe.
I'll just add some more fiction to it. But things are moving along, and then there's like the brakes being pushed. And it's like sometimes there's the spontaneity, and the spontaneity is fun and enjoyable, and it's mutual. And then there's that point where there's a threshold that's met where consent is needed, and you would speak up, and it was a learning experience.
Yeah, and I think to your point, you initially found me giving consent to be
a turnoff.
And so we had to learn how to navigate, and we'll go into more details of this in our sex episode, is kind of around how you seek consent in a way that's sexy and fun and playful, right? And it's still being sought because you need to make sure you have that consent so the boundary isn't crossed and we can move towards vulnerability. And I think you found once you started listening to me, because I feel like you weren't, I felt for a while there, you were just so frustrated that you weren't listening. And do you know what I mean? And I feel like once you started actually listening to like, no, I want to continue in this action, but I need you to seek consent. This is how you do so in a playful, sexy manner. You were getting the results that you wanted in our intimacy, right? But it took kind of navigating that portion of the boundary setting, because what was happening is I was setting a boundary, or no, I had set boundaries prior, right? In other interactions. And then you weren't seeking consent. And so my boundaries would be crossed. I would be triggered. I would shut down. You would get frustrated at best, angry at worst, right? We would not be able to have a conversation about it. And then we would just have to spend some time apart and then come back to bed if it was the evening time, which was normally the evening time because we've got kiddos. And then we'd go to sleep like not touching, right? And then when you started to learn that like consent can be playful and sexy, and there's a way to do that so that you're not so you seek it, you're not crossing my boundaries. I can keep going with the action. I can enjoy myself with you. You can enjoy yourself with me. And then we'd close out with being able to share contact and like cuddle and stuff going to bed. Right. But I think it took
a little while for me to get there.
It took a while for you to get over that initial, because for you, my boundary set in a sexual capacity was a rejection. And that was what you had to navigate, is that like, I'm not rejecting you as a lover. I am rejecting your lack of consent and your boundary cross. That's what I'm rejecting in this moment, is that you crossed my boundary and you did not seek consent, but you would take it as a rejection, as a lover, as a partner. Would you?
No,
I mean,
that's absolutely what was going through my mind.
And so I think you tell me, I feel like we've come a long way with that boundary
absolutely
setting and moving through those boundaries.
I think in all the phases of the relationship.
We're growing, we're moving, we're cruising. And so where else do you feel like boundaries come up for us? Or do you know what I mean by that? I mean, boundaries are always present,
sure.
But where they...
I know going back 3 years, looking back in the rear view 3 years ago, I had trouble expressing boundaries regarding trauma from my prior relationship. I had all of this emotion, all of this trauma, I had all this legal stuff going on. I needed to talk to somebody about it. And, you know, I understand because of your own trauma with regards to this whole mess. It wasn't something you wanted. You weren't in a space. That
I
was a
could not be
boundary.
your therapist and your wife in this situation.
Right. So, but that was an area that I seemed like looking back, I perpetually crossed it because something would happen. It would been frustrating or whatnot. And I just needed to express myself. And it was continually, I was crossing your boundary there. And I'm very sorry that we had a lot of tumultuous months, years, it seems like, where
It was a couple of years.
where that was just a stressor, and it was crossing a boundary all the time. And I felt like it was getting less and less and less boundary crosses, but I dropped the little crumbs here and there that kept it in the picture. And I'm sorry.
I accept your apology. I appreciate you acknowledging that. It's interesting that had not even come to my mind, but as you've brought it up and I'm reflecting on it as you were speaking, that was a really accurate capturing of the fact that my boundaries were being crossed in the situation independent of you and the situation with your ex-partner. And then at the same time, you were trying to talk to me about it. And that's where I kept having to set the boundary of I can't be your therapist and your partner in this situation, right? And I'll use different diction because I know you have expressed that what you had in your past relationship was less of a partnership, and so I probably shouldn't use that diction. But it was really challenging for me because, to your point, I would be able to set these firm boundaries, and then you would still kind of crumble, like you said, crumble them in sometimes. And in my head, I'd be like, okay, it's just one small conversation. He needs to be heard in this. But then I would find that I got major resentment after that.
I think it was also, and then we can move on to a different topic. I think it was also painful for you because I had no boundaries in that relationship. Post that relationship, I was walked all over, and it was really hurtful for you to see me not have safe boundaries. And it caused issues. And when I did set the boundaries, it really caused a mess.
Oh, 100%. When you finally did set boundaries, it caused a big mess. And I was to blame for it, which is fair because you had grown in our partnership in such a way that you started to recognize that boundaries are important for self-preservation and for really you to maintain your safety and your emotional capacity. And in order for you to be the father and husband and friend and son and brother that you needed to be, you had to set boundaries. And so, yeah, that was a big struggle because you were setting boundaries for the first time. That was very ill received by the other parties involved. And at the same time, because you were just starting to dabble with those boundaries, they still weren't really being reinforced by you. You still would let them lapse. You would bring those boundary breaches to our marriage. And then in all that process, my boundaries were constantly being crossed. So it's like our boundaries in our marriage were being crossed. My personal boundaries were being crossed. Your boundaries were being crossed. And then it led to a resentfulness that I experienced that we really had to navigate because I was just, I didn't feel like I was safe emotionally. And I just did not feel like I was being protected. And then that led to resentment towards you, because I was like, all of this happened before you and I met, yet now you and I are trying to build something, and
We've got these outside forces.
we've got these outside forces that are creating such dynamics within our trajectory. And God, those boundary crosses led to me not being able to trust you, because I didn't feel like I could trust you to take care of me and to protect me. And then that caused, I would say, it deepened the resentment that I
Absolutely.
felt.
I totally acknowledge that. And
Oh, I know you do. And we've done we've done therapy, because again, we were recognizing that I was having these experiences as a wife. And so we had to get outside help from another couples therapist to help us navigate that perspective, because I would, for a long time there, you would ask me to wear both hats as a listening wife and then as a therapist, for you to be able to, and it just, you can't do that. That duality just creates, I don't know what it creates. What diction would you put to it? You know, when I would be in one moment, you would want me as the wife and partner, and then the next moment you'd want me as a therapist, and it was that duality.
yeah, I mean, it was like a push pull, and you're just not able to be fully in either shoes. Like, you couldn't be completely my therapist or completely my partner, because you were being pulled in both directions.
And I didn't want to be your therapist.
No, and
that's not what I wanted to
right.
be. I want, and like, as a therapist, you are taught and you operate. And again, someone who's been doing this as long as I have, you don't express your emotions. You don't relay that. And so it was impossible to be able to operate within both domains, because as a wife and partner, you express, but as a therapist, you don't. Mm-hmm. Right. And so it's like, it was just, it's interesting that you had brought that up, because I think I had forgotten about.
Not a bad thing.
I know you're not sad about that. I had kind of shelved it. That continuous boundary cross, because I think it was a number of years ago, and we have since healed from it. B, I think because it was literally daily. It was like a micro cross, like a micro boundary cross was happening with such frequency, but they were so minor that it created just this legacy for me that I've kind of like, what do I want to say? I've compartmentalized it and kind of put it into that phase. Or not that phase.
You've sealed it in Pandora's box.
Well, no, because I don't want to open up that again. So I want to use Pandora's box as a reference, but I have put it away as that part of our life that we'll never be returning to, right? So that's just like, that was that period, and it's wrapped up in all the things that are of that period. Because I think looking back now, my insights are all of that was all those boundary crosses, all that was happening as a result of many a factor that are no longer a part of our lives. So I'm able to kind of put it aside, because it would never happen like that again. Does this make sense?
Absolutely. I have tools in my toolbox now. I know how it is. I know how to operate a lot better in our partnership. I mean, to your point, it's the past. I wish I could go back and change the way we did some things, but I think ultimately, the therapy that we did, it gave us a bunch of experiences that ultimately strengthened our relationship and led it along the way to where we are today.
Yeah. how I think about that time was that you didn't have the skill sets yet. And then during that time, you were unable to obtain the skill sets. We were just trying to stay above water, right? Like we were just trying to keep our relationship afloat, let alone solidify, build upon it, create a true trajectory for it, right? And so for me, I kind of put that in a time where you didn't have the skill sets, and then you also didn't have the capacity to obtain the skill sets. But once you were able to obtain the skill sets because you had the emotional bandwidth, you have since really thrived in the understanding of boundaries, the creation of boundaries. Again, you are working on being able to express your own boundaries, but I feel like you have come a long way in respecting mine. Whereas just during that time, I kind of put it as a time frame where you didn't have the skill sets coming into it, and then you didn't have the emotional capacity to earn them or
to grow them,
to grow them, or just understand them at all. And whereas I feel like, to your point now, that's why our only real boundary cross that we have now is in intimacy, because again, those are skill sets and the ideology around consent and the understanding of my sexual trauma has been able to be understood more, because now you have had the emotional capacity to do that, develop those skills, learn more about me, kind of create some insight and behavior change within yourself, because you have the emotional capacity to do so, because we're no longer dealing with those outside forces. Agree? Or
Totally agree. And thank you for acknowledging that I've come a long way.
You have. I mean,
Well, thanks for the grace that you recognize I didn't have the emotional bandwidth to learn those skills years ago.
No. And it's okay. We're okay. So it's okay. But yes, it's all growth, right? And so there's seasons for everything. There's seasons of which we are able as people to develop and grow. And there's seasons where we need to stay stagnant and where we are. And there's seasons where we just are just trying to survive, right? And again, go into the hierarchy of needs by Maslow is just, if you're just trying to survive, or you aren't feeling safe, or if you're struggling with food or security or anything like that, you can't reach enlightenment. You can't really build trust, right? Because our fight or flight and our survival and our humanistic ideologies are kind of kicking in, right? And so with all that, and so kind of in last thoughts about boundaries, what would you tell couples who are struggling with boundary setting, kind of from the perspective of someone who didn't have them and has since had to develop them? And what would you say to couples who are, one, struggling to even accept the fact that they're needed, right? And then what have you learned about the setting of them?
I think first and foremost, setting boundaries are healthy for relationships. I can now look back, and me having time for myself with those boundaries, and you having time for yourself, has really helped our relationship. That time apart, I think it builds the want for intimacy and for closeness, and almost like a sense of loss or yearning.
Well, lust can thrive when there's a separation, especially if you've gone and do something that you really enjoy. Like for you, that's a good old pickleball. You come back exuberant and excited,
yeah,
right?
and something
and
to
it
talk
creates,
about, and so I to all y'all listening, set them. It's okay that you don't have to be every waking moment with your partner. It's not healthy to be with your partner every moment. Like you have you're two separate beings. You're going to have some interests that overlap, and you're going to have others that don't. And it's important for you to keep your individualistic nature with those interests. So I think be open to your partner. When something is bothering you, express it, set that boundary, do so lovingly. They're going to probably cross that boundary a few more times before it eventually sinks in, or at least speaking for myself, it takes me a few times to recognize it. But it's going to be good for your relationship in learning how to set them and then holding true to them.
I appreciate that insight for folks at home. And I would also just add that when you're setting your boundaries, they're yours. You get to decide what they are. And so you really have to work towards your partner for kind of respecting, because I know some people will try to push or challenge or change someone's boundaries. They're yours, right? You just set them and say like, hey, I'm not okay with this, or I'm okay with this, and this is where the line is. It is not respectful. It is not safe for a partner to say, okay, well, I see it. You say that's where your line is, but we're going to go past it. Can I convince you to maybe move it over here? No. They are yours to set, and it is the partner's responsibility to respect them. And if they need clarity and understanding around that, then they need to do so. And this is nothing that you have ever done, babe. Like when I have said, this is my line, you have never said, yeah, but can we maybe move it to here, which I very much appreciate. But I'm just throwing that out for the listeners out there. When it comes to a healthy kind of therapeutic modality, you have a right to set your boundaries. Whatever your boundaries are your boundaries, and they should be respected, right? Make sure you're communicating clearly, and like you said, kind of at the top of the hour, with respect and love. There's no need to be harsh about them, but we do need to make sure that they're respected. And so kind of with that, we are going to close out. Next week, we are going to talk about gender differences. So we're going to talk about, as a cisgender male, cisgender female, kind of how those dynamics affect our relationship, affect our marriage. Because I know there's a number of times and there's a number of ideologies and other components that make us butt heads, and or boundaries can be crossed because of our genders and how we think and how we align on certain things. And so with that, thanks for showing up for the conversation. Thanks for being vulnerable. Thanks for being here. I know it's a big ask to be married to a shrink, and I am thankful for you. So
I'm thankful for you.
Love you.
Love you.
Bye.
Bye.